Electrocast.
What up, and welcome to Or Whatever Movies. I'm your co-host Iris, and I'm here with my brother
Wesley. Hi.
And today we are discussing adapted screenplay nominee, The Two Popes.
The Two Popes.
The Two Popes.
The Two Popes.
A Netflix original film.
Yep.
I think Netflix hoped that this could be a Best Picture nominee, which it wasn't, though I think it was nominated for a Golden Globe.
It was.
But instead,
Doesn't mean anything.
it's recognized for its performances and its screenplay.
Screenplay, I'll give it. Going to direction, Fernando Marais, I think is how you pronounce it, was a big thing. He was maybe the biggest thing for a while. Constant Gardener. He did City of God, which everybody loved except me. And then he did a movie called Blindness with Julianne Moore that failed to strike a chord. It was going to be the next big thing, and it didn't do particularly well. And then he disappeared from American audiences. He's Brazilian, and he did a bunch of Brazilian TV and I think a couple of Brazilian films that never made it here. So with his resurgence, I was curious to see how it seemed like he was taking on a comparatively much smaller movie in scope about two old dudes.
Were any of those movies box office successes?
City of God was a critical darling. At the time, I think it may have been the highest reviewed movie of all time, something like that. This might have predated Rotten Tomatoes. I saw it on the strength of the critical reception alone and was disappointed, as maybe one is invariably when they see movies because everyone loves it and you're looking for flaws. Constant Gardener, despite having one of the worst titles in movie history, was pretty good.
Ralph Fiennes?
Uh-huh.
It was a Fiennes brother.
It was Ralph Fiennes, and I don't think they're brothers. Joe and Rafe, I don't think are related at all.
For real?
Yep. And I think that one had Rachel Weisz, who's married to James Bond now. So, Two Popes, written by Anthony McCarten, he has a lot of credits to his name. Theory of Everything was a critical darling.
Oh my God.
No?
I hated
Okay.
that movie.
That's not the movie we're reviewing. Darkest Hour, where if we are underground, we talked about Darkest Hour in the scope of
1917.
World War II being entirely in a bunker, in an underground bunker with Winston Churchill.
Another old dude.
Was enjoyable. Also wrote Bohemian Rhapsody. So, The Two Popes has a few strengths to run on. And maybe the screenplay might be one of them, and how you're going to make compelling the two of the oldest dudes ever in arguably one of the two of the largest roles in history. How you can make that compelling when they're talking about basil and flowers and shit. And then you have heavyweights. You have Anthony Hopkins, who was Pope Jeff.
Benedict the something.
Right. And then Jonathan Pryce, who I really like, who apparently looks so much like Pope Francis that when Pope Francis was elected Pope, Jonathan Pryce's son called him and said, "Daddy, are you the Pope?" So strange in a way that he was cast because of his uncanny resemblance to the Pope, in the same way that Tina Fey was a shoo-in to play What's Her Crazy?
From Alaska?
Yeah. But he also brings a lot of acting chops, a lot of experience to the role, and I thought did a great job. He, of course, was the captain man in Pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh.
Yeah, he was Elizabeth Swann's father.
Oh.
For the first three Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly what Jonathan Pryce should be remembered for. In The Two Popes, I think he did an admirable job as Pope Frank. And look, no disrespect. In thinking about this movie again for review, I'm not a Catholic, but I've come to understand how important this role is, the role of Pope, to so many people.
To the world.
To a lot of the world. That said, there's always been a weird disconnect because the Pope, as Tony Hopkins puts it, is the physical embodiment of Jesus Christ in the eyes of the Catholic Church and the Catholic populace. That's a strange position, especially when you're, Jeff in the Honda Civic rolling around and you're trying to do good work as a cardinal, or whatever, and then all of a sudden you're the Pope and you're the God man, right? I saw a clip where Pope Francis, who succeeded
Pope Benedict,
was speaking to a boy who lost his father. And the boy couldn't speak into the microphone, went up to him and asked him face to face if his daddy was in heaven. And then he asked the boy's permission to tell the crowd what was happening, because the boy's father was a non-believer, and the boy was worried that he had an illness and died and repented on his deathbed and converted or whatever, and was worried that he didn't go to heaven. And it just reminded me how this entity, how the Pope as a figure is viewed by the world. And to discount that role would be a shame. The point being, these were human characters in a human movie about a role that, to my eyes, had seemed superhuman in the eyes of other people. Does that make sense? The idea that the Pope is a larger-than-life figure, is the embodiment of God, and you're cast into that role from just being a guy, just being a dude who, once you find yourself in the papacy, realize that you can't do it. Anthony Hopkins played Pope Benedict, and couldn't do it anymore. His reign.
The verbiage is failing us.
His
Yeah, I don't know, reign.
His tenure as Pope lasted 7 years. He retired citing physical weakness and age. 10 years on, he's in his 90s now and is still trucking along, so I guess, whatever. But in the movie, they made no mention of that. Benedict's character said that he could not wear the robe anymore, and that he had to pass the torch for his own good. And of course, we had Jonathan Pryce's reluctant Bergoglio hesitant to take the reins, because I'm not sure how factual it was, but he was prepared to leave. So I went into this movie with no anticipation at all. Netflix doesn't have to make movies that cater to a specific to a massive audience. They're not worried about box office numbers.
Right.
They don't have to worry about distribution. They have a crazy amount of money that they can pour into any movie that they want, and people watch it or they don't. And they're hoping to find enough of an audience to make it successful and to make their impact felt critically. The Two Popes, I wouldn't have thought would have been made. I can see why The Irishman got made. You have a lot of cachet and a lot of history with Martin Scorsese and the gangster movies. The movie about the two popes, strange. Deceptively large in scope. A lot of green screen was used. I mean, it's not like they went to Rome and we're talking on the balcony. Massive crowd scenes, de-aging for the characters. We went into Bergoglio's history and his past. He's a divisive figure pertaining to his association with the military in Buenos Aires.
Yeah, the regime that was not good.
Right, so when he comes to Rome and is in the position where he now has to represent for all people, a lot of people didn't like that. When this movie was screened in Buenos Aires, the reception the filmmakers received was one of gratitude, that his history wasn't glossed over, that their grievances were heard, and that if he was going to be Pope, at least he was accurately represented in this movie. Now, accuracy is something that this movie strives for, but in kind of a vacuum. We do know that the two popes met 3 times before the transition of power, and beyond that, almost nothing is known about their relationship, whether or not they had a friendship. We can infer, based on things that they've said, personality traits from their histories, what we do know of them. We're sort of fascinated by people before they become famous.
So do you think that this screenplay is based on speculation?
Pure conjecture. Well,
Really?
There's a very loose framework, but yes, this is, and I made a point of checking again, it was inspired by the true story of the two popes and their interactions. We know what happened, the dates and when they were chosen, but we don't know what happened in closed quarters.
Man, I felt like the writer had a microphone in the Sistine Chapel and transcribed this into his screenplay, because Anthony McCarten's script is so believable. And I think that the intention of the film was to humanize the papacy. And from what I hear from you, it was a total success.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the humanization of the papacy is a double-edged sword. In one respect, of course, obviously these two men are human. and they have things that they love and they don't love, and one of them loves the Beatles, and they both love the Beatles, and they both love pizza. There are people that have to walk through life being aware of their surroundings and how they are received by people, and have to be very careful. Friendship must be difficult. Actual friendship must be hard to find. On the other hand, the humanization of the Pope and the fallibility of the body that elects the Pope was strange for me. Not being a devout follower of the Pope, I always sort of viewed him as being holier than thou, and the sort of entity that was chosen by God, as Kim Jong-un seems to think he is. But the opposite is true. There's a body who laboriously elects the Pope, and they play with they play with the marbles in the bowl, and they sew the letters or whatever together, and then the Pope is chosen. But he is elected in the same way that any official is elected. But once he's elected, he transcends to this sort of larger-than-life embodiment of Jesus Christ, which is strange to me. That said, if I'm going to watch the movie, I don't want it to be about two holier-than-thou men trying to decide who is holier.
Right.
You know? So on that level, I think the movie was effective in examining their friendship. I thought it was the Beatles as a means of communication and identification was an interesting choice. The Beatles, of course, John Lennon came under fire for saying that the Beatles at one point were bigger than God, bigger than Jesus. In a way, though, the Pope is like a member of the Beatles, is viewed as larger than life, almost mythical. People would never understand why any of the Beatles would want to leave the group, or why Pope Greg would want to leave the papacy. Right? The idea of him stepping down is inconceivable. He is the manifestation of God. Why would the Beatles ever want to do anything other than the Beatles? They're idolized in that way. It was interesting.
It was interesting. It was super interesting. Going into this film, I couldn't think that two old dudes talking in multiple rooms could be effective or compelling to me. And somehow it really was. And I felt like the filmmakers were so confident and crafted this film so deftly that they didn't feel like they had to pull punches. There wasn't a villain with knitted brows lurking behind the corner. The villain, if anyone, or anything rather, was doubt. And these two men struggling with it kind of together, or at least on their own terms, but being open and honest about it. I mean, it was so simple and yet so compelling.
There were simple elements, for sure, the conversation between these two, but we also had a sweeping backstory for Bergoglio. Sometimes I wondered if that needed to be so immersive to be effective, whereas if Anthony Hopkins' character had just said, you know, I understand you've had a lot of trouble. I understand why you're hesitant to take up this mantle because of your history, you know, with blah, 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 and the Pope, they would discuss it. But no, we got detailed recreations and de-aging of Jonathan Pryce's character and a younger actor portraying him, and even a romance. So was his detailed backstory, because we're talking about filling up a 2-hour runtime here, was it necessary and effective? Would this have been a lesser movie without the great pains they went to recreate his history?
Probably. It's funny though, it's definitely not the point of the film.
It's a lot of expense and trouble that they went through to make it convincing, and yet we got nothing whatsoever about Ratzinger's life.
Right, which is why Anthony Hopkins' character is nominated for supporting, whereas Jonathan Pryce is...
Look, sure, I got my reservations. I have my issues with Anthony Hopkins. I think he's a fine actor. Nobody can question his ability to play roles that stand out or withstand the test of time, but the dude also does it for the money. Not to say that he's not dedicated to his craft, but all I saw was Anthony Hopkins. But Anthony Hopkins wasn't the focus of this movie for me.
Yeah.
It was all about Jonathan Pryce, and I think rightfully so, as he was the emerging Pope, or the Pope to be. One other thing I want to get to, though, is the visual stylistic choices that this movie made. I think you're right. They could have pulled a lot more punches in order to make a dialogue between two old dudes compelling and convincing. And they didn't a lot of the time. There's a lot of restraint in this movie. There's a lot of patience. There's a lot of side talking where they're trying to skirt obvious issues about the Price character wanting to resign, about the Bergoglio character wanting to resign. And we're finding our way into this friendship. At the same time, the camera work was kind of inconsistent for me. Did you note this? There were times where they would pull like a wild rack focus, and it was like the camera was restless or bored, and the guy was, or the operator was trying to make it interesting.
Yeah, totally. There were jump cuts for sure.
Very unique camera tricks for a movie of this type, I think. And to me, it was more distracting than anything. I thought, how compelling can you make it? But as you said, the screenplay did a great job of making it compelling, where I ordinarily wouldn't have been interested in a movie of this type. Frankly, I watched this movie because it got attention from the Golden Globes, which don't mean anything, and the fact that we were going to review it as a Best Picture nominee. Otherwise, I wouldn't have seen it. I'm glad that I did, but there were also some weird tricks that were used to try to bump it up. They weren't as obvious as they might have been in some other movies, but definitely some strange choices, and they went down some strange avenues, as only Netflix could do, with all the money in the world and no accountability to anyone.
This movie is effective like a documentary is effective. A documentary, I think, is ultimately effective if it shows you a part of humanity, part of the world, that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And you get deep, deep into that. And, whether it's somebody else, another way of living, or, something intimate about another person's life. And I think that hearing your context on this film is interesting, because I kind of took everything I saw as truth and as a transcription of what actually happened. And to think that it was fictionalized, to think that it was crafted to be entertaining, is really fascinating to me, because I bought in. I felt like I was watching a documentary.
Best kind of movies, right? The idea where the suspension of disbelief is convincing enough that you drop any idea that you're watching a movie and you feel like you're watching real life.
Yeah, I felt like we were a fly on the wall in this very, very intimate, very human conversation. I don't know, I was surprised. I was surprised that two poops. I was surprised I gave two poops about two popes.
Yeah. This movie is all right. I don't know that it's a must-see. It's on Netflix, so you'll be able to watch it forever.
Yep.
I don't know if you need to see it ahead of the Academy Awards, certainly in this case. But an interesting experiment by Netflix. I like the freedom that they have to explore the movie-making space. They can do whatever they want. And in a world where major studios are looking to recoup their budget 3 to 4 times over in order to get into the black, I don't know that the Two Popes ever would have been made.
Right.
It would have been a destined for Netflix documentary. But instead we got this movie with good performances, certainly with good writing, some questionable camera work. But there you have it. We have this is a new era of filmmaking, and there's hope there.
Yeah.
Netflix is very good at what they do.
So there you have it. That's our discussion on Two Popes. All right movie from Wes. Surprisingly good movie from Iris. And we'd love to hear what you have to say. Will you email us, or whatevermovies@gmail.com, or leave us a voicemail about whatever at 818-835-0473. We'd like to hear from you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Electricast. Welcome to Tuning Into Sound Wellbeing, where we harmonise your mind, body and soul. I'm Amanda, your sound therapy expert.
And I'm Stephen, the curious explorer uncovering the mysteries of sound.
Together we explore vibrations, frequencies and the power of sound therapy and tuning forks.
Discover ancient wisdom, reduce stress and tune into a healthier life. Subscribe to Tuning Into Sound Wellbeing today.
Hey, it's Tim from 50 Years of Music with 50-Year-Old White Guys, the comedy podcast you had no idea you needed. Join Ben, Jeff, and me as we continue our musical road trip back through the years and around the globe. See, just when you thought all white guys were like Joe Rogan, you come across 3 educators trying to remember when we were cool.
50 Years of Music with 50-Year-Old White Guys.
Electricast.
TriCast.